This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, March 1879, it's America's first government shutdown.
Woo!
There you go. Celebrate it, everyone. This is 1879, of course, in the wake of the Civil War, and many of the divisions that may not have been resolved on the battlefield were kind of now playing out in Congress. Specifically, there was this question of funding for the government, which was being held hostage by a small but committed group of representatives. In this case, former Confederate generals, now elected as Democrats representing southern states. So let's talk about the first government shutdown brinksmanship in our nation's history, how it mirrors the showdowns that we continue to see today, and then in its own moment, how it kind of realigned a lot of those Reconstruction era politics in the wake of the Civil War. Because in the end, I think this move did kind of backfire in a way on Southern Democrats and reshift some lines. So here to discuss, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So do you know when you have a broken bone or something, and then you just notice that everyone else seems like they have a cast too? Like when something's happening to you, I don't know why I'm saying this, but I'm saying this because I feel like
no, I don't think that.
You don't think that? Like you don't think like you.
Maybe if I get a new car and I start to
see that car everywhere.
The car,
yes.
yeah.
Please at least accept my premise because it doesn't get much better after this. My point is. I think I'm having that with Rutherford B. Hayes, where I feel like we didn't talk about him at all on this podcast, and now I feel like all we do is talk about Rutherford B. Hayes on this podcast. And that might be true, or it might just be that I'm like, psyching myself up to just see Hayes everywhere. But this,
there's something to that. There's something to that.
So he is here. He is the president. He's a big part of this story, and let's actually start with him because we've often painted Rutherford B. Hayes as, he's a Republican, which in this period, we should note, the Democrats are from the South, pro-slavery, the Republicans are the Northern Party. He is from Ohio. We've painted him largely as sympathetic to Southern Democrats and not a real big booster of Reconstruction. But, it is interesting in this moment that we have him as a Republican from Ohio. But both houses of Congress are controlled by Democrats. So just like what's going on here, not this long after the Civil War, where the Democrats, who ostensibly lost the war, are now in control of both houses of Congress and seemingly in the driver's seat here, politically at least.
Well, I think it's worth going back to our last Hayes episode in this year of Rutherford B. Hayes, because we talked about the corrupt bargain that was made to make Hayes president, that the presidential election was functionally tied in the Electoral College. And so there was a deal made, which is that essentially the Republicans will draw Reconstruction in the South to an end, and they will get the presidency. But they didn't get Congress. Congress ends up going to the Democrats. And so the Democrats have power to kind of push to see how far this bargain is actually going to go. And that's when they start experimenting, as we'll talk about today, in order to see how much they can push Hayes around.
Yeah. And because Congress controls the purse strings, they can pretty much create legislation that will benefit them or hold certain dollars hostage in order to negotiate or manipulate outcomes that favor their agenda. And that's exactly what you see. You see this small group, I'll say, of the Democratic Party that is trying to use funds, withhold funds, in order to meet their political goals.
Well, so on that question, right, I think sometimes when you look at government shutdowns and these moments of brinksmanship, and, I think the debt ceiling debate is often about this too. There are moments where it's like, people who believe government should be smaller and that we should be spending less money or we shouldn't be funding certain things are holding out because it's a budget fight and they're fighting on that front. And they're holding up a sort of appropriations bill that. And then there's other ones where we're using this appropriations bill, we're using this funding fight to actually fight a battle about some other policy or agenda. So I think people probably know, given the intro and the time we're living in here. But Kellie, what is this fight really about? I don't think it's about line items on a budget, right?
I mean, all of the 19th century just goes back to black people. All of it. At its core, a lot of these political, economic, and even to some extent social issues go back to race, white supremacy, anti-blackness. And the Democrats' major gripe is that they want troops out the South. They want to be able to prevent African American men from voting because they know that they traditionally vote as a bloc, and that bloc always votes Republican. And so if they can get troops out of the South, then they can pretty much hold elections and use whatever kind of intimidation that they want to keep black people from coming to the polls and to keep black people from voting against their interests. So, I mean, really, this all comes down to how can we marginalize black voters so that we can get what we want, which is eventually a Democratic president in the White House again.
And to kind of add some context here, we talked about how the corrupt bargain was about taking that permanent federal military presence out of the South. But when it came to elections and enforcing elections, they wanted to have federal marshals and different people who were around to enforce the 15th Amendment, right? They had maybe given up on the 14th Amendment, which was to guarantee equal citizenship. But around election time, there was a reason to have extra monitoring of the polls. And that was what Democrats were pushing back again, because they saw it as an opportunity to press their advantage, right? If we can get the federal troops out of the South, we are going to solidify Democratic control over these states after Reconstruction. And this is our chance to do it because we have these majorities in Congress. So let's do what we can to make this a permanent majority.
And the Democrats had not really had power within the presidency since 1856. So it's about a over 20-year stretch in which Democrats, the power that they really want, which is the top seat, they can't seem to secure. And so if they can somehow get these black votes out of the way, or use this as a bargaining chip, use the budget as a bargaining chip, then maybe they can get what they want.
And so when you say bargaining chip, I mean the actual tactical approach here, the strategy is that starting in early 1879, as the congressional session is wrapping up, the House Democratic majority starts to attach these riders to funding bills that prohibit the use of federal troops from monitoring polling sites, as we've been saying. That is a tried and true method, right, to attach sort of totally unrelated stuff to bills that need to get passed to keep things running on time. But it sets up this showdown with Hayes, who refuses to sign these bills. And so then we get to this day in this window that we're looking at right here in March, where Congress is adjourning and they are at risk of running out of money for later that summer. Any thoughts on the fundings itself, provisions, or the riders itself? And then I want to talk a little bit about Hayes's reaction, which I think is interesting.
So riders on appropriation bills, that wasn't a novelty in this moment, but the threat of an actual government shutdown was. And in part, this is because the laws around budgets had changed fairly recently. So in 1870, there was something called the Anti-Deficiency Act that was passed, and it meant that government departments couldn't spend any more money than what had been appropriated to them. So once they ran out of money, they were out of money. They couldn't dip into the coffers, they couldn't borrow money, they couldn't borrow against next year's appropriations. And that is what sets up the showdown, because now you are going to have government agencies that don't have access to money, and there's this new law that says when you're done, you're done. And so that really ratchets up the stakes when it comes to this potential government shutdown. I think the other thing worth pointing out about what's different about this moment is Congress kind of it's still a small country, or it's still a big country, and transportation is slow. So Congress kind of takes off in March and doesn't come back for a long time. And so in order to resolve this showdown, Hayes has to call a special session to get everybody to come back to do their work. See, that wrinkle doesn't strike me as different at all. That actually strikes me as one of the most resonant things, that basically this is all about representatives wanting to go on vacation. And how many times have we seen big legislation play out where you really this person has
a wedding to attend this weekend. That's what's really going on.
Guys, we're about to go on break. Hurry up.
Their vacations are just much longer in this period because it's you can't just like hop on the flight and go back and forth.
Right.
I mean, they adjourned for like 75 days or something like that. I'm like, that's a long time to not be in session. So yeah, it's definitely different politics. But you get to see, I think, how much, that timeline or that time crunch comes into play because, people need to make these changes before all hell breaks loose, before the coffers run dry, before everything. I mean, this is a really intense moment politically speaking because people are not just worried about, the money running out, but like how they're going to get paid, how they're going to survive.
It's a high-stakes election year, so it's not enough to just follow along. You need to understand what's happening so you are fully informed come November. Every weekday on the NPR Politics Podcast, our political reporters break down important stories and backstories from the campaign trail so you understand why it matters to you. Listen to the NPR Politics Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
It is interesting, though, and we see this at times, too. There was, from a purely political standpoint, I think a misstep on the part of Democrats in that some of the riders they attached were to, like, army funding, and you see this sometimes, too. It's like, oh, you've picked the wrong wedge thing, to fight. And I think that did prevail here, that it's like, well, funding the military is still important to everyone. And, do you really want to be on the wrong side of that question? I think ultimately that is part of what applies the pressure. But before we talk about that 75-day gap and then what happens when they come back and ultimately I think Democrats do cave, I get it that Hayes is a Republican. It's Democrats who are pulling this move. But what they are asking for, isn't it stuff that Hayes has kind of largely already done? I mean, they're saying, we don't want federal troops all up in our business. We want the South to kind of regain some autonomy here. I mean, that was Hayes' whole thing from the jump, or at least in the way that I understand it. So, like, what's this fight actually about? Why is he actually sort of pushing back against their demands?
I think because it's elections.
Yeah.
It's one thing to say, okay, Black people are going to be second-class citizens in the South. We're not going to protect their rights. We're not going to protect their safety. But they're voters for the Republican Party, and we are not going to just cede elections in perpetuity. They kind of do end up ceding elections in perpetuity, but Hayes in this moment is saying, come on, like, we're not going to let this happen. And I think it was also about like that showdown between Hayes in Congress or Hayes in the Democratic Party, which is like, yes, I capitulated to you to get this spot, but you're not going to push me around on everything.
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, part of the corrupt bargain, the 1876 corrupt bargain, is like, we want federal troops removed out of the South. That doesn't happen all at once. In certain states, they're gone. In certain states, it takes longer for them to leave. But by the time you're getting to the end of the 1870s, certainly the 1880s, federal troops are all but gone. And that sort of completes the process of what Democrats wanted to just, how can we get rid of the Black vote? How can we get rid of any vote that's going to be in opposition to what we want?
Yeah. I also think, just to skip ahead a little to the legacy of this, the political fight, within Washington that's being fought here, I think is one of the big legacies, because this is, I think, a moment where it's seen as establishing a kind of precedent that, like, the executive can push back. The executive doesn't have to just sign everything. And so I think Hayes is taking a stand there, too, for his branch of government as much as anything.
Yeah, he vetoes it. I mean, he vetoes it 5 times.
Yeah.
He vetoes their bills, not once, not twice. Like, and he's trying to send a real message, like, until you send me something I can work with, I'm not going to sign off on this.
Yeah.
I also think there's a story here about brinksmanship and also like the innovations in Congress from out parties trying to figure out ways to push norms to their limits and see kind of what the political system and the popular appetite will tolerate. And what I actually find super interesting about this particular moment is that even Democrats are writing in and they're like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
This is bad. This is not what you're supposed to be doing. This idea that it was extortion abortion. I think that really resonated with people. And there was a broad popular pushback against this. It's like, this is a bridge too far. We don't want you playing, chicken with the federal budget.
Yeah. And this is also a small group of people that are trying to push these ideas. Right. Not all Democrats are on board, but you do have sort of this holdover of Confederate generals that are elected officials that are trying to, push these ideas, but they don't represent the whole. Now, I shouldn't say it like the whole is actually progressive, right. But I mean that in a way that you have an extreme or radical fringe that is driving, in some sense, the party.
That's so unusual. I don't relate to that at all.
Heard of that.
That dynamic is certainly there now, as is the kind of backlash. I think you're right. Like, they touched the hot stove a little bit here. I think that 75-day gap probably doesn't work in their favor, right? It's just like gives this pause where Americans look and say, hey, wait a minute, what's really going on here? They have some time to mull on it. Bankers are not happy with this. They're basically like, you're crashing the economy as we're trying to recover from the wake of the Civil War. And like political cartoons are having a field day with this. Some of the cartoons of the time, if you go look them up, they're actually, most cartoons from this era, I'm like, I do not get that at all, and that's not fun. Some of these are actually kind of clever, but a lot of them do sort of lampoon that idea. They're like, look, we already fought the Civil War, right? This feels like it's just, and clearly these are ex-Confederate generals. Like, they still want to be fighting the Civil War. But, there's a little bit of a sense of that. Like, this feels too much like what we just put our country through. We have to move forward.
This is kind of a side note, and maybe we can follow it up on a future episode, but, all of this talk of Confederate generals and Confederate soldiers, our researcher Jacob noted that 129 of the 192 Democrats in Congress were former soldiers in the Confederate Army. That's remarkable. Yeah. That's like 2/3 maybe. And that idea that people who were in all-out rebellion against the U.S. government are now members of Congress. Again,
elected officials. Yeah.
Resonates in some ways, but also like that's a little surprising. It's
79, y'all. I'm not good at math. What is it, like 10, 12, 13 years? Since
14 years.
14 years since the Civil War. I mean, the Civil War is still very much, a part of everyone's psyche. And it's not like one of this one generation removed. It's like, my father fought. It's like, no, I fought in that war. Right.
Against that guy who's sitting right across the aisle from me. I feel like maybe they didn't wave the bloody shirt enough. That's the problem with 19th century politics.
So as we should say, they come back. Eventually, Democrats do cave. They're able to withhold, a few $100,000 out of a sort of several $1 million budget, but it's largely seen as Hayes holds fast. These riders are removed. They keep the government open. Interestingly enough, you'd think this was a good moment for Hayes, but the real winner here seems to be a congressman by the name of James A. Garfield, who is also a Republican. He seemed to kind of really take up the mantle of decrying what the Democrats were up to, and this does seem to be the sort of origin story of him then launching his more high-profile political career, and eventually, obviously, Garfield becomes president. I mean, he called this a revolution. He said the Democrats are trying to enact another revolution. I mean, he was really strident in his language here.
Well, and I think maybe this speech that he gives in which he talks about this as revolution may be worth revisiting today.
Yeah.
It feels, again, pretty strong statement about what procedural revolution looks like. And I think that's worth revisiting.
Yeah.
And given the statistic you just mentioned, Niki, about like 129 soldiers having fought for the Confederacy, I mean, this is not a stretch to think that.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Super fascinating moment and interesting precedent that still echoes to today. Let's do a few quick also on this days. So we're looking at March 19th here. I will say that in 1918, March 19th was the first day that daylight savings time became official. The Standard Time Act was signed into law. It allowed for additional daylight hours to be added into the day to help save energy costs during World War I. It also established the 5 time zones that we know today. people like to gripe about daylight savings, and I think I do as well, and maybe its time has passed. The interesting thing here for me is that, I think people tend to think like, oh, it's about farmers and about the sunrises, and really it was an energy saving measure, I think, when it was first passed. And so, there's that consideration as well. But
driven more by cities. I say let's abolish not just daylight savings time, but time zones altogether.
Yeah.
Let's just do it. Let's go wild.
It's 2:00 everywhere.
Do you know about how time zones, it's this weird, like, I don't know exactly how to describe this sort of order of operations, but time zones were basically dictated by trains. Trains began, and all of a sudden we were able to move across periods of time, and people needed to coordinate schedules. And so it's, I don't know.
You know what's easy to coordinate? Everyone's on the same time.
Everyone's on the same time. Yeah, that's right. Your train leaves and arrives at the same time somehow.
That's right. And in 1931, Nevada Governor Fred B. Balzar signed a measure legalizing casino gambling.
And in 2003, George W. Bush ordered the start of the war against Iraq. Because of the time difference, it was actually early March 20th in Iraq when he does this.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.